Let's look at some examples of co-speciation. The first one is a really good example. It's one for which we have some local species that do this. I like it because it sometimes goes a little bit under the radar, but there actually are 3 species that all share a mutualistic partnership. So really it's like a trio, right? A mutualistic trio. We have an ant, but these are not your kind of regular fire ant, carpenter ants. These are leafcutter ants. And we do have a species down here that is endemic to Texas and down into Mexico. And leafcutter ants have this mutualistic relationship with a fungus, and it's been recently discovered that there is also a bacteria that is part of this mutualistic relationship. Here's how it works. The ants don't eat leaves, however, they do use leaves to grow their food. So you may have seen these ants around here. They're the ones that make the big kind of volcano-shaped ant hills. Sometimes there can be many of those openings, and then they find a good tree nearby and they strip the leaves from it. They don't eat the leaves, they take the leaves down into their nest and they put them at just the right temperature and humidity. And so their nests are designed so that they can actually move their little quote-unquote garden up and down to get it cooler or hotter as need be. And then there is a special fungus that they actually carry around with them when they make a new colony. And this fungus gets onto the plants, it eats it, loves it, grows really well, and then the plants harvest that as if it were a crop. So in a way, these are like farmers. Now, until recently, that was the extent of what we knew about this interaction. But it turns out there's actually a bacteria that creates an antibiotic that kills other types of fungus. And so the leafcutter ant fungus has evolved a resistance to that antibiotic. So that antibiotic is made by these bacteria. The bacteria get a nice safe place to live and to grow. The fungus gets food that the ants provide from it. The ants get food by eating part of the fungus. So there's really close interaction. And this brings up an important point. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to define ecological interactions. For instance, what is the interaction between humans and our domesticated animals like cows? Now initially you'd say, well, humans eat cows, so that's antagonistic, right? It's not good to be eaten. But really cows have flourished. They are, at least, if we define success by ability to reproduce, by, the low chance of going extinct, cows have done really well. So in a way, it might be easier to classify human-cow interactions as a mutualistic relationship. Humans get food, and obviously that's not good for the cows that you kill, but we manage them, we treat them, we keep them healthy as long as things are going okay and there's people are doing it right. Cows actually live a pretty good, albeit somewhat short, but fairly comfortable life, free of predators coming in, no lions or large carnivores seeking them out. So realize that sometimes these interactions can be a little bit complicated, and sometimes they don't fit completely neatly into one of the 6 ecological categories. They might show little signs or elements of 2 or more of the categories. But this is fairly clearly, in this example, a mutualistic relationship between the ant, the fungus, and the bacteria. Now, we can also see combinations of these interactions. So there are other ants that live on acacia trees, and the acacia trees have evolved to have hollow parts of their stems, usually in the thorns, that the ants can live in. So the ants kind of get a built-in home, and then they protect the acacia tree. If any herbivores get in it, they'll attack it. They don't eat it, but they just kill it and then knock it off the tree. So it's a mutualistic relationship between the tree and the ant, but it's also a way that the tree manages its antagonistic relationship. And there's even some complex communication where some of the herbivores have evolved behavior where they no longer will call for make a certain call, right? And so that they are less likely to have the ants find them before they can get to the stage where they are ready to move on to the next phase of their life. So the interaction between the plant and the ant is mutualistic. between the herbivore and the plant, it's a antagonistic relationship. And then you get these evolution of these characteristics depending on how these interactions go. One other very extreme example of mutualism is between the yucca plant and the yucca moth. Now, this is a little bit different than most plant pollinator relationships. In most plant pollinator relationships, the exchange is a bribe, basically, food, in exchange for moving pollen back and forth from different flowers. And so they both benefit. But this one has evolved to an extreme. In most of these species, there's only a single moth that will pollinate that yucca plant. And that's the only moth that does it. And the way they do it is by visiting the flower, and it's the female moths that do it, but they visit the yucca flowers, they will gather up a ball of pollen, and then they will fly to another flower. Now, these flowers have evolved so that they can no longer be pollinated in the normal way. Most plants are pollinated when a little bit of pollen gets on the outside of the flower, and then it pushes the pollen tube down into the ovule so that it can fertilize it. But in these, they can no longer do that. The pollen no longer have the capability to push down and fertilize. So what the yucca moth has to do is chew a little hole into the side of the developing flower, and then she pushes that ball of pollen in there, and that pollinates that flower. Now, she also lays a single egg. And so that egg that she lays will hatch, grow. It will eat part of the developing seeds, but not all of them. One moth can't eat all of them. And so again, it's kind of this combination of mutualistic, but there's also a little bit of antagonism going on there. But it works really, really well, and it has evolved so that they are completely dependent on one another. The moth's only way to reproduce is using that flower, and vice versa. The flower's only way to reproduce is with that one species of moth. Now, in these mutualistic relationships, there has to be some sort of a check and balance or a control against free riders or against cheating, quote unquote. Now, they're not like cheating trying to do it, but if there was a moth that had a mutation and it laid 2 or more eggs, then that would be a short-term benefit for that moth. It would have more babies. Instead of having to get a pollen ball and chew a hole in for every single one of its babies, it could lay 2, 3, or 4, and maybe they'd all survive, or most of them would survive. But that would destroy the host plant. All the seeds would get eaten, and the host plant would go extinct. And then if that happens, the moth is going extinct. So the only way we see these close interactions is if there's some sort of a check and balance to prevent cheating. And the shorthand is that if you are in a mutualistic relationship, what is good for your partner is also good for you. And conversely, what's bad for your partner species is bad for you. So if you have behaviors that make an impact, a negative drag on your partner species, that is going to be in the long term a really bad thing. And so checks and balances evolve in these systems. Now, we're going to introduce a new vocabulary word, cospeciation. Cospeciation is a very strong form of coevolution. And as the name implies, it basically means that when a species breaks into 2 populations and eventually goes down the road to becoming 2 new species, and we talked about that in previous discussions. When that occurs, that has such a strong relationship between this species and one of its partner species that almost inevitably that partner species will either also speciate or maybe even one of the lineages will go extinct. And so we can see that there's a pretty good correlation. There's some cases where a moth switches to another host. But notice that many of these species show very similar relationships and they have co-evolved along. So as the yucca speciates, the moth species that is connected and tied to it will speciate also, and vice versa. So if one is going one route, the other one kind of gets dragged along. And that is cospeciation. Now, most of the time we see cospeciation in mutualistic or antagonistic relationships where there is a one-to-one dependence, meaning that that is the only other species that you can use to survive. So the moth yucca is a good example because this moth is completely dependent on that one species of yucca. It can't use others, and vice versa. So if you had a predator-prey relationship where that was the only prey item that a predator could use, that would also entail strong chance of co-speciation. But if you have a predator that has like 3, 4, or 5 different prey items, and it can switch and rely more on one during some years or during some parts of the year, and then go back and rely on the others, that's less likely to have speciation, because if one prey item evolves defenses or a way to avoid predation, it could rely and just spend more effort and more time going after its other prey items. So we have less chance of co-speciation. Now, there's still coevolution going on. You're still going to have some impact, but it's not risen to the level of what we would call co-speciation. And so if there is a mutualistic relationship, there needs to be some sort of a response or a check and balance. And so it can vary greatly in different organisms, but in the long run, it comes down to this idea that what's good for you is good for your partner and vice versa. So if behaviors begin to evolve in a species and it hurts your partner, it's going to, before too long, start hurting that species. And so those are selected against and eventually are removed from the population because they cause such a dramatic bad impact to both species involved in the partnership. So here's our little yucca moth. This is an actual photograph of one of the species and the flower of the yucca that it is connected to. Another good example of a mutualistic relationship we haven't talked about are nitrogen-fixing bacteria and the plants in which they are associated. So these little nodules are grown by the plant and they serve as refuges, as little places for the nitrogen-fixing bacteria to grow. So the nitrogen bacteria make a little bit of fertilizer by taking atmospheric nitrogen and turning it into a more usable form. And then they get a little safe place to live inside of the plant. So if this bacteria did less nitrogen fixing and just started living in that plant, its plant would start to die off. And so nitrogen fixing bacteria that don't fix nitrogen well, they don't do as well because they aren't supporting and providing a good connection to their host. And so you can see a little bit about how cheating, quote unquote cheating, would be bad for these nitrogen fixing bacteria because they're hurting their host and they rely on their host for a safe place to live. And we can get some really fun and interesting, sometimes you might even call them bizarre, coevolutionary interactions between predator and prey. The diagram on the upper right here is one for which we have a long fossil record. This large snail is a predator, and it crawls around. It's a very slow motion hunt scene, not quite as thrilling as the ones you see on the African savanna. But it very slowly crawls along. It's faster than the clams it feeds on. And when it finds a clam, it wraps its muscular foot around it and gently pries it open. And after lots of pressure, it will eventually get open the clam, put its little mouth in, and eat the clam inside. Now, as this progressed through millions of years of evolution, for which we have good fossil series, we can see a progressive increase in the size of the muscle that keeps the clam closed, and that results in an increase in the size of the muscular foot on the snail. We also eventually see the snails evolving a hardened, almost like a pry bar on one end of their foot that they will use to push in and try and pry open the clam. And so we can see damage in the fossil record to these clams that have suffered these attacks but then survived. So this is kind of give and take. And in antagonistic coevolution, we often have this back and forth where changes in one species are driving the evolution and changes in the second species. And we can see this very, very rapidly in our parasite-host relationships. So parasites, and we'll talk about this again when we get to our last unit, which is on evolution and medicine. But parasites have kind of this sweet spot that makes them most effective and most likely to survive. And it's in this area where you make your host a little bit sick, because that little bit of sickness creates the symptoms that then allow you to spread and find new hosts. But you don't want to make your host too sick. Now I say want to, obviously they don't have any wants, they're just viruses or bacteria or fungus, but it's not good for that parasite if it makes its host too sick, because then its host will die before it has a good chance of spreading to another host. And so in parasite-host relationships that have been together for a while, you kind of evolve this intermediate virulence, where you're a little bit virulent but not super virulent. Occasionally, a new pathogen will get into a population and it will be super virulent. We'll talk about why that occurs and some of the evolutionary things that impact it. But if that occurs, it may sweep through a population, maybe even cause a major crisis in that population, but eventually the individuals that are a little bit resistant will have more babies, and eventually the host will become resistant. The population will no longer suffer from that disease. It might still be in the population, it might be a long-term interaction, but it will no longer be as damaging a disease as it was when it first got into the population. And so we can see it on both sides. We see damage done to the clams here by the new features and new tactics of the snails. Sometimes there is damage to the snails that looks like their shells have cracked as they have exerted too much pressure trying to open a reinforced clam. So there's this really cool series in the fossil record where we can see a evolutionary arms race. Change in predator results in a change in the prey. And then the prey maybe evolves a defense, and then the predator evolves to get around that. And there's back and forth and back and forth. And in some ways, this antagonistic relationship is a little bit like interactions between individuals in the same species sometimes. We can have antagonistic interactions. This is an example of not truly coevolution because it's within a single species. And so it's really more of a sexual selection interaction without coevolution is reserved for interactions between two different species. But this is the reproductive part of a male beetle, and it looks like a weapon of war. And the reason is it's one of these really weird situations where the male has evolved a behavior that actually damages the female. And it's evolved because they are in a promiscuous mating system. If he damages the female, then she has trouble mating with future males. She can have his babies, but less likely to have other males' babies. And so it was a good thing for the males, and so it evolved this really, really bizarre and strange reproductive structure. Now, of course, that's not good for the females because they get damaged. They can't have as many babies as they would otherwise. And so in this species, females have actually evolved a sclerotized, that means hardened and reinforced, reproductive tract. So they are no longer as damaged by the male. So again, it's this back and forth. The male evolves one thing, the female evolves another one, back and forth. So you should know that this antagonistic coevolution in some ways mimics interactions like between males and females when there is a clash between what's good for one group, the males, what's good for the other group, the females. And so that can also mimic this antagonistic coevolution, this kind of evolutionary arms race, but within a species instead of between species. And there are lots of host-parasite relationships outside of what we typically think of diseases, like ectoparasites, that also show some amount of coevolution. And in some species, it's much more of a tight interaction, so we almost always get coevolution. And in other areas, they can jump and do what's called a host shift much more commonly. And so we can actually, if we have a good phylogeny for both the host and the parasite, we can actually map instances where a parasite jumps from one host that was formerly on to another one. And so we see these two groups of C. macrurei that were closely connected to one another and may have originally been on two closely connected species of pigeon, but they have jumped now to, I guess on that one they still are closely related, so I guess pink and pink they match. But in other ones, like this one, has jumped to a close relative, and in some cases we have a species that's been able to jump from two species that are closely related to a third one that's much more distantly related. And so in this case, we can actually see how the evolution of the birds, their feather shape, how close together their feathers are, how that impacts the evolution of their prey. And this may limit and may even help us predict if a louse lives on a large pigeon, it may not be able to jump over into a smaller bird, but it could jump over into another bird like a large dove that was a very similar size and feather makeup. So host parasites can show this very strong antagonistic coevolution. Now ideally, because these lice are bad for their hosts, right? They eat blood, they cause allergic interactions and skin conditions. They can damage the feathers in bad cases severely enough that it's even hard to fly or stay warm because your feathers are so damaged. And ideally, the host would get rid of it completely. And so, they evolve defenses, evolve resistance, and sometimes hosts do escape and completely get rid of their parasites, but that's fairly rare. usually this interaction is so strong back and forth that coevolution maintains the connection once it's established. But oftentimes it will result in a kind of an intermediate phase. Even ectoparasites, if they completely chew up and eat all of the feathers of their host, that's going to be a really bad thing. And so even ectoparasites will often evolve some kind of interesting behaviors, and they can vary greatly. And again, they're random mutations that benefit the host a little bit, but still allow the parasite to do its job and make its living. One really cool example of this is a mite that infests moth ears. Now, they're not technically called ears, but they're the equivalent of ears. They're hearing organs. And moths have two tympanum, these hearing organs, on the side of their abdomen. And when a first mite, parasitic mite, gets onto a moth, it will find one of these little ears and make its home, and eventually inflammation and eating will make the moth deaf in that ear. Now, they have evolved the behavior where the second mite that gets on that moth will go with the first one, and then the third one, and then the fourth one. They all go to the same ear. So the moth maintains some level of hearing because both ears do not get infected. Now, this is important because moths use these ears to avoid the ultrasonic predation of bats. And so if mites were infecting both ears, the moth and the mite would die when the bat ate it. And so this behavior has evolved where they can still make their living but not have such a detrimental impact on the host. So in many cases, we'll kind of see almost like this armistice or truce in the coevolutionary arms race where, I'm still going to chew on you and eat you, but I'm going to do it in a way that's not as bad as it could be otherwise. And they're not thinking about it, making treaties and things like that, but it's just a behavior that's evolved because these parasites are so dependent on their host that if they harm them too much, it's going to be bad for them also.